Thank you, Chair. And thank you all for coming before the committee today and for sharing your experiences. There's over 200,000 children at risk of poverty in Ireland, and more than 90,000 are in consistent poverty. This means they don't have guaranteed access to sufficient food, shelter, healthcare, and other essentials that I think most of us take for granted. And they're truly shocking figures. And your submissions and experiences are essential insights into helping the committee understand and advocate for the change that we very urgently need. If I have time, I have 3 questions for the Children's Rights Alliance, if that's okay, and a question for Spark then as well. For Tanya, I was struck by your inclusion of the concept of child-proofing local development plans and national plans to meet the needs of young people. So during the county development plan for Cork County Council this year, we did a consultation with primary schools and transition years, and it was a really fascinating process, and it kind of came about because we felt we don't hear enough from young people. Politicians are contacted all the time, our constituency offices are always inundated, but it's always from the older populations, and of course we represent the younger populations too. And for the most part, all that the children wanted or were calling for was, safe infrastructure to walk and cycle to school, really sensible and reasonable requests. There was some other very good ones like slides from the top of the town into the sea and stuff like that. But I'd love for you to elaborate on this concept of kind of child proofing and how it can be achieved. I think that's really important. Secondly, the state, we know that the state spends just 0.3% of GDP on early years, which is well below the European average of 0.8%. And the UNICEF recommendation benchmark of 1%, and you emphasise the need to provide free access to childcare for families on the lowest incomes through the National Childcare Scheme for families in receipt of a medical card. I just wonder if you could expand a bit more on the importance of such a measure, of this kind of a measure. And then thirdly, you highlighted the acute nature of child poverty in Ireland, and you locate the school meals programme as being an important state response, and rightly called for the programme to ensure that all children have access to hot, nutritious meal daily in education settings. And I suppose my understanding is that this would have multiple benefits, both in terms of nutrition, but also participating in education and behavioural impact. And I was just wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on that and the impact that it could have. You highlight the systematic and kind of specific issues faced by single parent families, and I think we're all aware of that, and in particular you highlighted the issues around domestic abuse. As we approach the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, you stated that the key solution to ending gender-based violence is to offer parents real options to leave abusers, and currently existing abusive and violent situations, it can be even more difficult to leave because of the risk of poverty and homelessness. And we've also learned recently around, citizenship. Oftentimes it's linked with your partner. It really makes it really difficult to leave abusive situations. I'm just wondering if you can suggest some actions that we should be putting to the Departments of Social Protection and Housing to tackle these issues. Thank you very much. And Chair, if that's too many questions, like a written response is fine. I'm not sure if I have time for all of them. Thank you.
No, we're actually okay for time. So I'll start with Tanya, and then I think Louise or whoever else wants to come in as well. Okay, so if you want to start anyway, Tanya.
Right. Thanks very much, and thanks, Deputy Kearns. It's great to hear that a consultation happened in Cork, because that's, if you were doing a piece of child-proofing of a local development plan, that'd be actually critical. That's one of the key things that you should do. What we're seeing in lots of countries across Europe is they're starting to do what's called child rights impact assessments, and they're basically checklists of different things that a decision maker needs to think about if they're trying to make sure that their service or that their local plan of delivery is in line with the interests and the rights of children. And so what you find is, a lot of the way lots of companies, organisations operate, or authorities, public authorities can operate, they don't necessarily they're not necessarily making decisions that have children's rights at their heart or the best interests of children at their heart. And that means resources go in a different direction. They don't go towards, let's say, the walkways or playgrounds and things like that children need in the local areas or local facilities that children might might need. So really, we know that the government is actually exploring this and thinking about this. How could this work? And again, it would be great to try and see this trial this on a pilot basis to get some local authorities to adopt this approach and to see what recommendations and changes it could lead to. Because where it's been used, what's interesting around the COVID piece, Scotland did a similar analysis when they were devising their COVID restrictions. And they actually decided, after consulting with children's groups, to keep the playgrounds open, basically, in Scotland. So I think it's a really important one to explore. In relation to the childcare scheme and the recommendation we've made there, so, I mean, Gail has mentioned a quarter of our income was going into childcare. And as we know, there's great things about the National Childcare Scheme. But the way I would look at it is, I don't think Gail should have had to experience at all this issue with the costs of the market, that if you happen to live in a part of the country where childcare is expensive, you're going to have to pay more. What should happen is it should be that someone accessing the scheme on the low income shouldn't have to worry about that. The scheme should find a way to pay a higher subsidy to them. And we had, in consultation, we've been talking to Spark, what would be the way to address this? And Spark said, well, most of the people we're working with will have a medical card. So if you use that as to unlock, let's say, a higher level of subsidy, that would work. And in other child poverty areas, the medical card is actually used in a similar way. Now, the rates haven't increased in the medical card in a very long time, and that does need to be addressed. But you would be able to ensure that some of the families on the lowest income wouldn't have to deal with this problem of the cost. So we think that should be something that could be dealt with early on before we move to a new funding model. It's something very quick the government could implement. And I'm delighted you picked up, I suppose, on the school meals piece, because what we know is in all the countries that have the best outcomes for children, a hot school meal is part of the school day, has great outcomes. It exposes children to food that's really good for them. They're more likely to eat it if it's hot as well. They're less likely to eat it if it's cold. And it really helps families who are really struggling on the breadline, with very low incomes. And also they're trying to juggle work as well. And one of the things that you saw, even for the programmes we have in Ireland at the moment, when the restrictions hit and the schools closed, the families were in crisis around food. So we really think this is an area that the government needs to invest in. What's amazing about it as well is the pilot programmes that have already been run. The former Minister, Regina Doherty, initiated this piece of work, and it's been followed on by Joe O'Brien and Minister Humphreys as well, is that the data coming back from the schools is really interesting, because they were saying, one particular school said, when children left to go to the dentist, they'd never come back for the day. We've children coming back in to get the meal. Basically, they're staying in for the full day to get the meal. They were saying children are eating vegetables for the first time. They hadn't had access to them at home. Maybe the family don't even have cooking facilities at home. Children were they're not cranky, they're in better form. All of those things that happen when children are hungry, they find it very hard to learn. And emotionally, they find it very hard to just navigate with the everyday life. So we know it really helps children actually learn and socialise. So I really think it's one of those areas where there's a win-win, and like all children will benefit. We think everyone should benefit from it in a very non-stigmatizing way.
Thanks. Did Louise or Francis, do you want to come in? Louise, do you want to come in first on any of those points?
Yeah, just in relation to the domestic abuse, one of the things that we are really concerned about when we set up Spark first, it wasn't an issue that we thought would be so prevalent, but what we do get is an awful lot of women approaching Spark when they're in the midst of domestic abuse and violence, and they're looking at their options, and they ask us, what are the options about the family home? What are the options about social welfare? What are the options about the maintenance? And we go through the options with them, and they're absolutely always appalled. They really believe they're more supported than they are when it comes down to it. And so many, it was really shocking. One day I spoke to a woman, and she basically said to me, and I think I've said the story before, but she basically said to me, so it's a case of homelessness or hospitalization for me. And she made the choice that 2 or 3 hospital visits a year was okay if her children weren't going into homelessness. And I don't think that's a realistic option, and I don't believe anybody realistically. But when we hear the question, why doesn't she just leave him? This is why she doesn't just leave him, or this is why he doesn't leave him, because there are no real alternatives there. And we know the chances of ending up in homelessness is very, very high for somebody abusing it. Now, one of the things that did happen during COVID, which was really welcome, was the enhanced rent supplement for domestic violence. And that was a really, really positive move, and we really welcome that move. And it really does give people an option. However, during the same time, there was a High Court ruling, which means that all mortgage payments are fully assessed as maintenance now. So that's contrary. So if you're in a family home and there's a mortgage on it, and even if the abuser has been barred from the house and been court ordered to pay the maintenance, social welfare will assess that full mortgage payment as maintenance going towards the children, and the family can be left with no money to live on. And we've heard cases of where people will literally forgo the mortgage being paid so that they can feed their children. And that's counterintuitive, because that family will eventually have their home repossessed, will eventually go into homeless accommodation, and will eventually be on a HAP payment, which will cost an awful lot more. So there's really simple measures, to support a family when the family breakdown is happening, to ensure that the if their mortgage is being paid, let it be paid, but not calculated as child maintenance, and leave the family with nothing to live on. So there's very simple moves like that. And if we had, Senator Lynn Ruane spoke about her child maintenance bill. We believe if there was a child maintenance bill that didn't involve going back to court, would make a huge difference as well. I mean, people, when they get away from their abuser, do not necessarily want to go into a combative court system to argue for their child maintenance. It should be something that's just taken from the revenue, assess the payment, and it's paid directly to the parent, and especially for families in domestic abuse, but in fact all abuse. It's one of the things we're really concerned about is when somebody does escape from an abuser, and again, this is from lived experience in Spark, there are two things that continue post-separation: arguments about access and arguments about child maintenance, because they're the only two things that can be controlled. And if we had that taken out of the court system and again put into the best interest of the child, both for maintenance and access, it would make a huge difference and would give people real options to leave abusers. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Go ahead, Deputy Cairns. Yeah.
On that. I was just going to say, thank you for highlighting those things. And I think sometimes the structural barriers in those departments are things that it's easy to not be aware of until not that long ago. It was the West Cork Women Against Domestic Violence brought to my attention that, it was always the way that when somebody was presenting as homeless, that they would go to their local community welfare officer. And with the rise in homelessness cases, that's now been transferred to the local authority. So now you have to go to the local authority. And for example, where I live in West Cork, and it would be the same in so many constituencies, there isn't a bus from very many towns to where that place is, that you can't present to your community welfare officer anymore. And then on top of that housing, the staff in the local authorities aren't used to dealing with those situations. They're not kind of trained in terms of being trauma informed. We can't expect them to be. And that, there is examples, I think in some counties, for example, Clare, where they have kind of multidisciplinary team, and the housing are sort of trauma informed. They have training in relation to that to make sure that they're supporting people, because you hear stories of people turning up, very difficult time, trying to leave the house, perhaps with children with them, with pets, with luggage, no transport, and then they're told to go and find their own emergency accommodation. And then when they find somewhere, they might say, no, actually, that's too expensive, even though it was on the list. There's all of these kind of structural things. But thank you so much for that information. I think it's really important for the committee to hear it. Thank you.
Thanks.